Hello, everyone. I'm with Yoon-Ji Lee today. She is a composer and teaches composition at Berklee College of Music. Thanks for being here, Yoon-Ji.
Thank
I
you for having
really,
me.
really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I know you were in New York City recently
Mm-hmm.
for the premiere of one of your pieces
Mm-hmm.
titled Untamed Things.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to know more about the piece.
Mm-hmm. Untamed Things is based on the inspiration, based on the book. It's called Wild Things. It's written by Jack Halberstam, who I met during the Guggenheim reception, and we had a short conversation, but it was pretty profound. So it moved me, and I started reading his book. And especially in chapter two, he wrote about Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, and his interpretation about uh, this performance, created by Nijinsky and Stravinsky. There was an appropriation from the Russian folk culture, especially including the ritual, the ceremony, and actually the appropriation wasn't quite right. But then how the indigenous culture was used in the modernism culture, especially in our context, avant-garde music and then avant-garde arts, and like performing arts. So based on the book, I was intrigued, what's gonna happen if I'm gonna realize this kind of structure that I was incorporating the Korean shamanism. It's called Gut. I transcribed 동해안 별신굿. So it's a particular ritual which was done in the east side of Korea. And I wanted to see if I juxtapose that Korean shamanism good and Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Um, what's gonna happen in terms of chemistry? And so I was appropriating the Stravinsky's Rite of Spring in my piece by juxtaposing with the Korean shamanism music, and then making them influenced each other. And then at the same time, the book was also talking about the nature and then the civilization, culture, gender, politics, identities, and how the sort of wild things, can have a positive potential to influence and to be connected with each other. So I try to realize, that idea into the piece. Yeah. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. It's, I think, a trademark of yours to have these intercultural compositions, and
Mm-hmm.
I know we'll discuss some more about that later.
Mm-hmm.
But I know this was in New York City,
Mm-hmm.
and I know New York City is one of your many homes in the
Mm-hmm.
world
Mm-hmm.
because you went for your PhD there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, would you like to share what New York means to you as a city, maybe professionally or personally, and how that city shaped your career as a composer?
Mm-hmm. So I moved to New York City in 2007 to start my PhD program at NYU, and I believe uh, some portion of my music in terms of musical identity, uh, yeah, it was born in New York City. So especially sort of making the hybrid type of experimentation, especially like within like some sort of like in one piece or in one artistic world that you sort of juxtapose all the disparate elements together and then making something new out of it. um, I think I first of all, there were so many different musical influences that I was able to uh, enjoy, and then be influenced, by all the musicians and not only about music, like visual arts and other performing arts, but also when I was creating my own things, in my music, even though it's a small experiments, but there were always friends or colleagues or like fellows, they were always very supportive and very open-minded. So for me, it was the best place to to be grown as a especially when you have this particular cultural identity, but actually you don't need to limit yourself as as a culturally someone, because everyone is culturally someone at some point, so on some level. So yeah, a place that I was able to enjoy artistic freedom. Yeah, so that was my New York City to me.
I know a lot of people refer to New York City and many other places in the world as a melting pot. There's so many different cultures. And I know you yourself have described your own music as bibimbap, which is like a mixture of a lot of things. Um, and I wonder if you think, as the world seems to be getting more globalized and people are interacting with other cultures all the time, do you think intercultural composition making is sort of inevitable? And I'm curious whether you also see this in your students at Berklee.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I can talk about other composers. Definitely. I mean, also I sometimes I adjudicate some festivals or conferences, and I get to see a lot of, I mean, to me, like young composers from the different cultures, so I guess the intercultural music making is very important part of our our musical world. Here our musical world means what we compose, like contemporary classical music or experimental music. And yeah, I especially at Berklee, because I guess because of my musical background and my compositional languages, I think I teach more international students than other professors, actually, and they particularly bring the projects which come with their culture ideas, culture backgrounds, and what they want to do is they also want to do experiments with their cultural materials. And usually we have a lot of discussions, and I really want them to be able to find their own voices in this intercultural music making. So yeah, I think I take it seriously as important my job. So
Yeah. That's awesome. I want to talk about your time as a student. So you can talk about any period of time you like, but I'm curious about what kinds of composers influenced you during your own youth. I know you like the music of Elliott Sharp, for instance. How did those composers impact your compositional journey?
I do. Elliot Sharp, I met. I was lucky enough to meet him in person and to be influenced in person, because I was selected one of the associate artists for the artist residency at the Atlantic Atlantic Center for the Arts. So he was the master artist. So I spent 3 weeks with them. So there was a great opportunity to be influenced by him, but also I admire different. I mean, several composers. Like I could mention Mary Namasher, Susan Ciani, or also Bearfurter, Olga Neuwirth, George Lewis. Many composers, who and Haya Chernovin too, yeah. And then also my composition teacher Robert Kogan is one of also the most influential composers in my life. But the thing is, like, it's hard to say there's one particular composer who really shaped, my music, which that I composing these days, So, but I guess like in the back of my head, the individual influence that I took from like individual composers, that really kind of that helped, my languages, I guess direct or indirect way. Yeah, maybe I can put it that way. But one thing that I want to mention is when I was in college, I went to see Lee Sang-yoon's cello concerto. Actually, that piece really moved me to want to become a composer. So there was a one section that like the at that time because I didn't know the microtone languages then, but like I emotionally I was so engaged with that strong microtone, the passages. Also that was the moment that I felt like, oh, there is a music that it's a classical music, but it can express something that usually cannot be expressed through major minor modes, like the emotionally it was on another level. And because I knew also his background, so I thought like he was authentically expressing his emotions through his music. So yeah, I can tell Lee Sang-yoon is one of the sort of biggest motivations to move me to the desire of wanting to a composer.
Was this experience during your undergraduate degree in Korea? Yeah. So I know you. So as we just said, you were in Korea for your undergrad degree, and then you came to Boston to NEC for your master's degree, and you arrived in the States as a Korean person, and you started living in a new culture. I'm curious about how your awareness of your own national identity and ethnicity and so on and so forth, how that changed before and after your time in the States, and what that means to you as a composer, or maybe even as a human being who's in a society where identity is presented to be important and things like that.
So yes, I think it took a while to feel comfortable about being called as a Korean composer. So when I first came here, like everyone called me as a Korean composer, and I felt so weird, because when I was in Korea, nobody called me as a Korean composer. So and then I started to think about it, and I wasn't offended at all, but sort of it took a while to understand how this society has a sort of a habit of labeling people based on the categories. But at the same time I started to develop a certain understanding about this American culture where there are so many immigrants. So it's like it's not intentionally trying to do something do harms on us something like that, but it's a labeling, right? But then at the same time, at first I didn't want to be limited by that labeling, because I wanted to keep my own cultural freedom, and it's a very complicated question because my identity keeps changing. So of course when I first came here, like I was so sure that I'm Korean, and we all have these questions like in the first 3 years, like when I'm in Korea, America is like always compare the two cultures, then like what is, rejectable, what is acceptable, what is weird, strange. But then as time goes on, actually you also started to be assimilated with this culture. So there is one moment that actually it gets blurred and you get scared,
Yeah.
right? So because at the very beginning, like, oh, I'm very different from Korean Americans, but then like, because I came here when I was 26, so it was pretty late, right? So I was sort of fully grown up, and before that time, I didn't speak English at all. So I had to develop this language skill at the time, and then I realized that speaking this language, or which also you must have sort of go through the cultural differences, right? Because the language gives the structure of thinking of certain things in a certain way. So then so you realize that, like, now it's been almost more than sort of 2 decades, and our cultural identities, or even social identities, in not only like one or two, like Korean or American, or let's say in between Korean American, but I think you started to develop unconsciously like multiple different identities. So sometimes you might not know what identity you are playing, or you are sort of sensing in yourself. So it's a very complicated and sensitive matters, but it's very hard to define who you are once you are in this culture, especially in this context of diaspora. So I think all the immigrants are going through the same thing. Yeah, but there's a profound realization of who I am. But then like at every moment, every month, or every year, you have to run into this situation all the time. And but then like in your social activities, you almost act like Americans, like how to engage with Americans, in this American culture. And the most scary thing was when it's like almost 6 years ago. So I went back to Korea, and then actually my friend brought her friends, who was a gay couple. Okay, so in Korea, actually, like, so now I'm an older Korean American. I felt like the culture dramatically, it has changed. So, like in public, gay couple, expressing their affections. I was just shocked, So, oh my God, I got so behind, with the Korean culture. But then, but then the husband was actually American. The my friend's husband was American, and then we started talking to each other, and then he said, "Oh, Yoon-Ji, like, I started talking to. I felt like I came back home. You are so American, So I was like, "What are you talking about?" So I was like, "What do you mean?" Like in America, I always, right, like. Yeah. I always feel like sort of I'm kind of in between being, like I cannot belong to this culture forever, I feel like. But then he said like, oh, you are so American. Your accents, the way you making the gestures, your facial expression, it's all Americans, So I was like, oh my God, I lost my Korean Korean identity, But then, when you speak Korean, actually, you don't do that, You don't do the facial expressions, and then you don't do like those American accents, or so it's a kind of a different being, right? So I just want to say that there are moments that sort of you naturally melted it into the culture, that you don't even know how much you became what you are now. So yeah.
Well, as you know, I can relate to that, and our friend How You, I'm sure he can also relate to this. I'm curious about how much American culture, or even let's say Western music, you were familiar with during your time in Korea. Because if I take my example, like I certainly grew up watching a lot of American media, maybe like YouTube videos, or certainly a lot of American popular music, TV shows, and things like that. Was that something you were exposed to very much when you were growing up in Korea?
When I was growing up in Korea, it's 90s, and actually there was the moment like the well these days, everyone is talking about K-pop, but
Yeah.
K-pop, K-drama, the industry started to have our own culture, in a more strong way than before. So I think I kind of one generation before my generation, they were more exposed to the American cultural influences. But I guess in my time, I listened to a lot of Korean ballad. And Korean also, like, it's the beginning of Korean hip hop, Korean ballad, and then the idol, the first generation of K-pop idol. Yeah, the industry was, growing really fast. So I think mostly I was exposed to that culture rather than, American culture. But of course, American culture, the famous pop songs, they were always, there. You could listen to it. And but also there were really interesting parts that, like, on Sunday there was a TV program that it's broadcasted by the national, television broadcasting company about like Korean traditional music.
Yeah.
So they are, on the TV, and like I think actually the music itself was very interesting, but how they sort of, made the production of the show was a little bit strange. But yeah, I watched, those, the educational sort of like Korean, they try to preserve the Korean inheritance. So I watched that type of show. But also my mom subscribed. I'm from Busan, the second city in Korea, and she subscribed Busan, Busan City Symphony.
Oh,
Yeah, so she brought my brother and me, to the concerts when I was young, like 6 years old, 7 years old, to the concerts, and then I learned the piano. Yeah, so piano was important part of my musical life, although I don't practice it anymore. I lost all the muscles, but um, yeah. So those were sort of Western music. Oh, and then I grew up in church, so definitely the church music is also important part of the Western music culture.
I feel like American culture is probably the only culture in these times where it doesn't matter what part of the world you're from, you'll know something about U.S. culture.
Right.
Like I don't think, for instance, a lot of people here would know about Korean court music, for instance. Like it's maybe not something they've heard of, or even K-pop. K-pop is super popular now, but I'm sure there are many people who don't know what K-pop is.
Sure.
On the other hand, I feel like everyone has heard a rock beat, like and that has spread over to all cultures somehow. So that's very interesting to me. I know in your music you've explored the idea of how um, unsettling identities can emerge as a result of migration. I would love for you to talk a little bit about that, because I feel like it's a super relatable topic for many people, certainly international students. And there are so many of them now. I'm curious about your thoughts.
I mean, in general, or the particular piece, the migration in my
You can do both.
both. So I mean this conversation is connected to the previous, the conversation. First of all, I wrote a dissertation about intercultural music making, based on Elliott Sharp's Then Go, which is written for Pansori and Intonaro Mori. While I was doing the research, I found that intercultural music making is really unsettling, unpredictable, because, well, usually when we come from this Western music education, regardless of where we got this Western education, usually the composer has the authority of controlling what we are producing, right? What we are creating.
Yeah.
But in the case of intercultural music making, actually, there's always a part that we cannot control. So, especially, I think, from the perspectives of the Western composers, I think I should be very careful in putting the words. But historically, there have been a lot of idealization. So sort of, conceptualize, what it is, more than actually in reality what it is, in its own cultural context. Like for instance, John Cage, I mean, I really love John Cage. I really admire John Cage. And of course, I think part of my music or part of our music, how can we not talk about his influence? But he definitely idealized the concept of I Ching, and then taking just the concept, right?
Yeah.
And then, use it into the concept of, his music, right? But usually Asian composers wouldn't do that, right? Or like freely like combining Japanese traditional music, Korean traditional music, and something Indonesian, like it's like pan-Asian music making. I think that's only possible. I think the Western composers can do that, right? Because we are very we are very cautious in combining different Asian music, because we know its meaning of the cultural inheritance within the particular context of the nation's culture and the politics or the history behind it, right? So I think in terms of intercultural music making, especially, so in my dissertation I talked about composing, performing, listening. All three aspects of music making always there is always it requires a transformation. So for instance, like for instance, in it's not from me, but no, actually maybe I can talk about my dissertation. So for instance, Then Go was it's written for pansori and intonaro mori, which is the noisy instrument from Italian futurist, Luigi Russolo. Then the piece actually written for pansori Korean traditional vocal music, but they couldn't. So the production. So there was a concert. It was a reconstruction of intonaro mori, and then they commissioned the 13 composers, and Elliott was one of the composers, and he wrote this piece. But the issue was they couldn't find a pansori singer.
Okay.
So they found a Korean singer who not a pansori expertise, but they found a singer, and then they premiered the piece. And there were two premieres, but the one that I analyzed in my dissertation was, so it was performed by Do-hee Lee, but Elliott wrote atonal pansori melody with it's written in English. The lyrics is in English, but she retranslated old English words to Korean.
Wow.
And then changed the melody, the entire melody, and then sounded like minyo, Korean folk music. So actually she performed a piece which is not Elliott's the original composition. Right. And the performance got the review, and the performance itself was great. But I thought, then what about the original composition? So I electronically reconstructed intonaro mori, and then I found a pansori singer. So I realized the original score in my dissertation. So, but then I found that, for instance, that in pansori there are 3 different modes, and each mode comes with a certain emotions. But Elliott's pansori melody was atonal, so the singer, the pansori singer, like didn't know where, how she could locate, her emotion to express the melody, or in pansori, the manipulation of the vowels, the vowel, the consonant as a noise sometimes, or the vowel, the expression of vowels, the diction, and intonation, sometimes very exaggerated. It's part of the very important, the expression of the stories. But so it's in English, but she's singing in Korean way, expressing all the vowels in the pansori way.
Right.
So, which means if she really needs to deliver the original intention, maybe she's not supposed to, right?
Yeah.
In English, we don't speak in that way, right? But can we say that she's doing something wrong? Actually, no, not, right? So I went for the third realization, so reconstruction of the performance. So I found on sort of the Western singer, coming from our like opera training. Yeah, so Mary Mackenzie. So she recorded this piece, with the same intonarmory, the realization of intonarmory sound. And for her, so with the pansori singer Min Jung Choi, it took like an hour and a half to record this piece. And basically, I sort of, I guided the English word first. And she was able to read the Western music score. So these days, all these Korean musicians also got Western music education.
Yeah.
But still, it's atonal. So like augmented fourth, this kind of interval. I kind of played the piano, and then she memorized the intervals, and then she sang it. But with Mary Mackenzie, it only took like 15 minutes, and then she fully expressed the words, like so either what I realized was, either the performer herself or himself, they have to transform the way of they are performing this music, or like perceiving, this music, right? Like coming out of what they were trained for, right? Aesthetically, technically, both. Or the composer need to find a way of transforming the way how they composed, but then they need to step out of the box, and then they need to create a different environment that, the performers. So a mutual transformation is required, but this process is in a way like depends on which culture you're gonna work with. You don't know actually what aspect of culture, intercultural music making, will bring unpredictable, unsettling, part of the music making. So that was actually something that I write about, in my dissertation. So in terms of, the musical identity, or that's also as a human being, it keeps changing. So so I was, I have invested a lot of time to think about identities for a long time. But also, what, like in visual art, or as I mentioned, I sometimes educated some festivals, conferences, and do you know how many Asian composers are in the States these days? And we all are writing about our culture, So in a way, it's not new anymore, although it's a very significant, important matter for us.
Right.
Because, like most of us are doing this, So I thought about, still I'm thinking about it a lot, but also it's sort of it's an open question, right? So I'm obsessed with this question, but also I just want to acknowledge that I'm not the only one who has tried to bring this identity topic into my work. So I don't want to say, I'm the expertise of, intercultural music making. No, I'm not at all. I'm still sort of, like searching for the closest way of appropriating something, But I also know that I'll fail on some level, in bringing, a certain cultural, experimentation into my piece, so yeah. So for instance, so another topic about my piece, migration, it came from my own experience as an immigration. So I had a very difficult time with the changed immigration policies. It took a while for me to get a green card, and there were some dramas that I had to go through. So yeah, musically, I thought of my identities and culture, music making, blah blah a lot. But in reality, actually, this is reality. Your immigration status, like you don't know your future. Tomorrow I have to pack my stuff and then leave this country while I have a job here.
It's happening
And
these days.
yes, and also like you left your country a long time ago, so you lost the connection, sort of, to be linked to go back to that society. I, of course, if I go back there, if I try to work hard, maybe I can also get a job, and there could be a future. But I mean, right now, and right, so at the moment I couldn't see my future at all. So it was very, very unsettling, unstable, and even like very like scary, moment, in my life. So yeah, during that time, actually, I wrote migration, and also it was during the pandemic. So I was watching the migrating birds, migrant birds, so on YouTube, in my country. So I was looking at them, and I want to go back to Korea actually. Just missing home, homesickness. So all those emotions were coming together, and then I thought about, oh, maybe I can write about this. So the migration actually was intended to on the stage. I made it, all these performers keep changing their identities as they move the different stations. So for instance, at the beginning of the piece, two performers become two birds. So they started the piece with blowing the bird whistles, and then they gathered at the first station, which is the guitar, where everyone becomes guitar players. So yeah, I mean, there's a guitarist, but so the percussionist is still keeps his own identity as a percussionist, like playing crotale. But the rest of the performers are they are playing the guitar. And then after the first section, they return to their original position, but then musically it starts transform into a percussion music. So all of them have to perform percussions. And during the rehearsal, actually, we had a extra session that they had to learn what's the best way to perform the percussions from the percussionist. And then one of the sections, they all become also pianists, piano players, but with extended techniques. The guitarist is playing ebow, on the strings, and then the saxophone player, playing the strings, with the air strings, and then so inside the piano thing, and then the pianist to play piano and then ebow, and then the ending is, so guitarist, the percussionist never actually really compromised his identity throughout the entire piece, but that at the end of the piece, the percussionist becomes a guitar player. I would say a guitar player. So basically, he's playing prepared guitar. So basically, putting the electric guitar on his lap, and then playing it in a percussive way, with the mallets.
Oh, wow, okay.
So he didn't lose his identity in a way because of the way of playing the guitar, but he is playing the guitar. Yeah, so that's how, like, in the piece, how migration affected them. and then they keep changing their identities. And yeah, it's in a way it's a like sort of music therapies that you have to watch it, otherwise as an audio it doesn't make sense. Yeah, so yeah, that's the piece.
I think I would love to see it live at some point, or maybe check the
Mm-hmm.
score out. You said something that reminded me of my previous guest, Pavle. He's Serbian, and he likes to incorporate Serbian folk music in his solo piano playing when he's performing his own solo piano compositions.
Mm-hmm.
And we spoke about how he learned about Serbian folk music, and I think his answer was although there are festivals out there which promote this kind of music, and although he also heard this folk music through his, let's say, grandparents and so on and so forth, we kind of found out that there isn't as much of a folk music education in his
Mm-hmm.
country.
Mm-hmm.
So the example we gave was, in today's world it's much easier to learn about, let's say, Bach's counterpoint
Mm.
in an organized, systematic manner
Mm-hmm.
than it
Mm-hmm.
is to learn about your own folk music
Right,
culture.
right.
Would you say that's also true for Korea? Like, is there a Korean folk music education system, or is it like very obscure? I'm curious about how you learned about Korean folk music traditions, because you expressed that there was a gap of between the composer and the performer, and
Mm-hmm.
how they didn't really understand each other
Mm-hmm.
when it came to that. So I'm curious about how you learned about Korean folk music.
Mm-hmm. So briefly, I mentioned that there were sort of Korean TV programs. They were broadcasting Korean traditional music, and so that's just something that I watched. And sort of growing up, I guess it's kind of 1970s, 80s, the early 90s, sort of still, Korea was changing so fast, so there were some traces that I felt that, I was able to, be influenced, or how can I say, like, watch some Korean music performances. But in terms of how much I appreciate it, uh, I'm not sure actually. Definitely I took it for granted. In our public education system, I think we learned some minyo, as I mentioned, the Korean folk music melodies. And of course, there are very famous Korean folk minyos we all know somehow. We learned it or we heard it a lot, but didn't, in terms of pedagogy, as a like sort of music education, the methods, as a music education, I think they weren't really developed to teach Korean traditional music, as a part of public education at that time. But I heard recently more concerns about preserving, the traditional culture, and they implemented some music education part of, yeah, Korean traditional music is now part of the public education. But during the college, actually, we had to take Korean music theory classes, and then also taking some Korean music, some performance sort of type of class. I wouldn't say we learned like an instrument like for a year or something like that, but definitely we had to learn. I had 2 sequences of Korean traditional music courses. It was required in our curriculum, and actually there was the moment that I was mesmerized by pansori, because when you saw pansori on the TV, you what is like, like, it's not okay, but you're more into like all this Korean pop star, who are handsome, and like, but then like who is in my age, like she just looked like me, but then the professor called a student, I mean, who is a pansori singer, her out, and then in front of us, she started singing pansori, and then the entire classroom was resonating. So this, wow, like this girl, like like me, not very like a big body or big, doesn't look like whose voice can resonate the entire classroom.
Right.
And then it sounded so real, and regardless of, because I my major was composition, which means Western music composition, and of course to enter the college we went through all these like exams, like counterpoint, harmony, piano, like blah blah, like rondo form, all this composition. But then like wow, just she just blew my mind. Then there was the moment that and then the midterm was actually singing pansori, midterm exam. So we that you would never be like her. So you felt horrible about yourself. But anyway, so like that moment was sort of a real personal engagement with the Korean music. And then as I told you, after I came here, everyone was calling me Korean composer, Korean something, Korean something. And then I started to think that, so sort of, I did go through identity crisis, twice, three times. Now I feel like, oh, once upon a time, but these days like, oh, whatever, but in the first 5 years, I think 2 or 3 times I went through a big identity crisis, and then I started asking myself, if I started Korean traditional music, so if I was born like 100 years ago,
Yeah.
but in fact, actually, as a woman, there was no way to be a musician. So so when I first went back to Korea, there was 2007. So I came here in 2004, and then 2007 for the first time.
Wow, 3 years.
3 years.
You just stayed here.
Yeah, 3 years I was here, and then I went to see the Pansori live performance. And then again, I was so mesmerized. So after the performance, actually, I went to the stage, and then I wasn't confident enough to learn pansori, but I wanted to learn the drumming, pansori drumming. So I reached out the drummer and asking him if I could have a lesson. And then he said he doesn't give lessons, but he recommended another intangible asset, master, the drummer. So I took lessons at the time, but then I realized that, oh, it doesn't matter either Western music or Korean traditional music. I really love music, because while I was taking these pansori drumming lessons, like, it was just so fun, and every time I had goosebumps, and like I practiced there for 3 hours, whenever I went there, and then for the first time in the last lesson, I accompanied the pansori. Oh wow, it was unforgettable experience. So it was just, yeah, just so I was so in love, and also the teacher told me I was very talented.
Oh,
So
of course you were.
so I was like, okay, So
Yeah.
actually, it doesn't matter. Actually, like what music I'm learning or what music I'm composing. Actually, it's the same me, who wants to be a musician, and who loves the music, who loves composing.
Yeah.
So they kind of a little bit actually sort of settled myself as a musician, as a composer,
Yeah.
that I want to keep doing this, and maybe there is no reason that I get confused, about like my talents or my future as a composer, what's gonna happen to me. So yeah, that was a valuable lesson for myself.
A moment ago, you mentioned how immigrant composers get labeled based on their nationality. I read something about Unsuk Chin. I think I will link it. But essentially, the author of that paper argued that, you know, she negates that nationalist framework and she doesn't really subscribe to this idea of making Korean music and so on and so forth. I'm curious about your thoughts on that because I'm sure there are a lot of composers out there who don't really want to be described by their nationality and who maybe just prefer to be identified by their individual identity instead. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think individuality is the most important thing as an artist, and I compose music because to me artistic freedom is the most important thing, and because of that, actually, in a way, ironically, composing music in the sort of Western culture allows us to have a more individual characters.
Yeah.
But ironically, ironically, the Western culture also always putting us in a box. So I do respect that Unsuk Chin. I mean, we call her Jin Unsuk. Unsuk Chin has made her way of being herself in her music, but somehow it's very difficult for us to escape from the categorization, of us, or putting this way, maybe without labeling us, which is linked to our nationality. Maybe the Western culture, Western society still does not know how to define us, in their context, or in the sort of, they have to create the third context, something, I don't know, like beyond the context, something has never existed before. So I think as long as we kind of live with this labeling, I think it's our own choices. So I think it's okay to keep creating intercultural music with my own culture, or with proper research and with proper appropriations. I still want to sort of keep the boundaries, which is very, I mean, in terms of authenticity, morality, the ethical issues. I want to keep them, for the sake of the cultural identities. That's how we can keep the respect. But I think we should be able to create what we want to create, But I also, Unsuk Chin is I sort of think of Unsuk Chin as the sort of the second generation of these Asian composers in the West. So first generation, Lee Sang-yoon, Cho En-chung, Toru Takemitsu, and they all made their career as Asian composers, who brought, Asian music to the Western culture, and their influences were so huge, right? So the next generations, keep being asked. When I went to Germany, also, people asked me, "Oh, what does your music sound like?" Like 2006, a long time ago. Like, does your music sound like Lee Sang-yoon? So Lee Sang-yoon is the reference for them to be able to imagine Asian composers' music, So I'm sure maybe I've never talked to Unsuk Chin, but she might have wanted to reject it, And usually artists or composers, we don't want to be easily framed, based on just one reference, right? So I think that's just something that we need to be careful. But I think it's a very complicated question, because as long as we live here, as I mentioned, these days I don't take it personally about being called a Korean composer, and on the street, many people think of me as a Chinese, and also now like yeah. In America it's fine, like, because I know why they think of me in that way, so I don't get offended anymore. But of course in the beginning I was offended, but like, so I think it's sort of, it kind of, like, we need to find a way of it's a also it's a kind of unsettling way of, because it's all experiments still, I think, there's no one answer. And you know what, like, with, for instance, Korean traditional music, I mean, how you also plays shakuhachi, but I think from the American audience point of view, it doesn't really matter with the shakuhachi playing, like, how you use contemporary music versus like Japanese folk music. Once you bring shakuhachi, the American audience will think that, oh, this is traditional music. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there is no reference. Which one is traditional? Which one is, more? And actually, in traditional music, there are a lot of, from our perspectives, like sort of contemporary classical avant-garde music perspective, there are extended techniques, many, like, I'm sure Japanese music or Korean music, Chinese music, or Indian music, like a lot of techniques, something very similar to, I mean, from the Western's point of view, like extended techniques, right?
Yeah.
So we cannot actually very simply, from the Western audience views, actually it's very hard to tell what is what, So thinking of the kind of aspect, I think whatever we do, actually what I'm saying is very hard to escape. How we can be seen, portrayed, to the Western audience. And for me, I have more chances to put my music, to play, to get my music performed here, performed by American performers, for the American audience. So yeah, I think, but artistic freedom, that's very important, So yeah, I'm still trying to find what it is. So yeah.
Well, on a personal note, and since How You is here, I will take the opportunity to share this story. I wrote a piece for piano, so I played the piano, shakuhachi, and just electronics. It was like a moving speaker. And I presented this piece, and a faculty member somewhere in New York City, he asked me, why did you write for shakuhachi? And he had this extensive background in, um, intercultural composition making. And I just told him straight away that I didn't really have a deep reason for it. It was because my friend plays shakuhachi, and I feel like that, maybe it's a generational thing now, because there's so many international students like us, and we're just friends, and we don't think about the deeper cultural contexts. And personally, I found that they were supportive. When I said, "Oh, I didn't have a deep reason. I just wrote for shakuhachi because my friend plays shakuhachi," and they were like, "That's a good enough reason." So I wonder if you've noticed the attitude changing as with the newer generations or younger generations, I should say.
I think definitely you guys are a different generation, and I don't know who the composer is, but um like, for instance, something that I was trying to avoid for a long time was, still here intercultural music means bringing traditional music, traditional instrument, the authenticity of the culture, and then combining it with Western music. That's the concept of intercultural music. And always these performances bringing cultural meaning, also sort of like an educational aspect of it, like, because the audience learns about this culture, through this performance. But I think your generation is literally the mixture of so many different culture. For instance, K-pop. K-pop is the production of so many different. One piece, one song, one tune, is produced by multiple composers from multiple nationalities. Like, so it's not only about its K-pop, because K-pop market is always think about the global market, and you guys are exposed to K-pop, right? And then keep listening to this, like multi-cultural, postmodern, music, postmodern music. I think because of it's a very classic way of putting it, but sort of, it can be very superficial though, right?
Yeah.
It's like a light way of, I don't want to call it superficial, but like very, very easy to be exposed to all different kinds of cultural influences, and then creating something out of it. That's I think very natural for you guys in a way, I think. And also, you guys are here, especially in the States. You guys met, at school, and just spending time together as a friend. And you listen to how you're playing the instrument and making music together. So I think actually it can be the most important reason for you, because your friend is playing the shakuhachi, right? Yeah. So I think that is fine. But something, it's hard to say. I think your generation definitely more familiar with globalization, in a way, putting this way. And I think definitely different from our generation. But I think, but something needs to be still cautious is that when you have to deal with a cultural material, always think about, I still think about the cultural context of the instrument is very, very important, because of the history behind us, But this is different though. I don't know, like colonialization, or imperialism, or like post-colonialism, or exoticism, or these big words behind the history. I think because when you make intercultural music, you are gonna run into this is a deep comment, power game.
Right.
Because like electronics, and then traditional, like like for instance shakuhachi, or the instrument coming from different culture, it's a little bit more flexible to manage, like tuning system, or in terms of dealing with the noise, or putting a musical context, it's much more flexible. Right. But if you make something like, for instance, in shakuhachi and piano, think about it, right? So then sort of which one has more influence than the other in the piece, and then if they can get along together, how to juxtapose together some sort of, they kind of in the position of play or interplay their influences in the piece. So I think it's just in one aspect that you need to be a little bit, if you are on, maybe I might be very, very prejudiced here, but like for me, because I'm an Asian composer, so I think about it, But I don't know if I was a Western composer, if I think about it this much. Do you know what I mean? Right. Yeah, because I might have a less bitter history behind, Yeah. So, and as I live here longer, I think I'm still sort of a little bit obsessed with the authenticity of the culture. But I found more that the authenticity of the culture is not very important in the American culture. Yeah. And that kind of thought is sort of appeared in on every level in so many music and arts productions. And actually the individualism is much more important here. So what are you creating with this, you know?
Right.
What artistic word do you have with this, you know? So this is the tool to shine you.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm at the moment very confusing between the authenticity of the culture and, you know,
Yeah.
what will shine my
Right.
artistic word, you know, as a making an individual voice.
Mhm.
So I think, yeah, I mean, so I guess, you know, then I realized, wow, I must be Americanized.
Right.
Right? So now because I understand why they are creating like less authentic
Yeah.
work, you
In
know.
favor of individualism.
Yeah, so then wow, am I, you know, do I start understanding them, you know?
Yeah.
Then am I becoming one of them, you know?
Yeah.
So this is a very transitional moment for me. So I actually started reading my dissertation, you know, because that was 10 years ago. And I was so sure at that time, you know,
Yeah.
I do know the authenticity of the culture, you know. So it's interesting living here. And yeah, so I might, as a teacher, I might say still like, you know, the necessary research
Yeah.
always, you know, for the instrument.
Mhm.
And that, I mean, even you don't know if you're gonna take all of the cultural, the backgrounds or baggage or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
behind this, I mean, embedded into this instrument.
Right.
um you will eventually you will find a way, your own way of creating something.
Mhm.
But I think knowing it is already very, very important, because then you have a sort of a measurement, right? So like sort of
Right.
how far I could go from, you know, the sort of the, it's hard to actually say what's the original form of the traditional art. It's a different topic.
Mhm.
But still I think it's very important to do just proper research.
Mhm.
And because for me also, I said, you know, I've just said like Irish music or, you know, other cultural music like Indian music, you know, I love listening to, you know, Indian music too. But I'm scared, you know, if I want to incorporate these cultural
Right.
materials, you know,
Mhm.
how I can appropriate it, how much Indian, how like the research material
Yeah.
is like this big, right? So like, oh, from what point should I start with, you know, should I
Yeah.
begin with? So like I think anyone could be in this kind of situations. But if I know the what's the like proper attitude, you know,
Mhm.
in approaching this cultural material, at least,
Right.
you know, like you have a sort of like the basic manner
Mhm.
or at least the showing, you know, the trying to get the deep understanding of what it is very important. So I think it's a great opportunity that, you know, your best friend has this, you know, amazing instrument. And then it's a great opportunity to create something different, something new, because shakuhachi
Yeah.
have also different timbre in it, right?
Yeah.
So um a great opportunity. But I would say, you know, always, you know, just do your best to do the proper research for the cultural material. Yeah.
Mm. I certainly didn't do that this time, but maybe next time I will.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's super fascinating. I'm so eager to see how this will go. You know, maybe like 2 3 generations away from me, how will they think of intercultural music making, and what will society look like? You know, maybe let's say in the year 2030 or something, or 2040. You know, I wonder. But that's super interesting.
40 is right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, time flies so fast. When I went to NYU, I was in my 20s, but
Yeah.
now I'm in my 40s, so
Mm.
I didn't know. Time flies so fast.
I know you said you basically started learning how to speak English when you were 26. And I know you've also written a piece which was inspired by an instructional or educational film, which taught immigrants how to speak proper English. Could you explain a little bit about that project?
Oh yeah, the piece is called "The Accents." So there's it's a YouTube video. It's called the 48 Paddington Street. So it's a British instructional film for immigrants to teach proper English. And in the video, the phonetic professor teaches, how to properly, pronounce the accents of the English. So there's one passage he described that, oh, you are, pronouncing, I mean, the intonation, the accent, your accent is like da 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 da, but English is like da da da. So I took them as a motif, rhythmic motif, and then in the piece, this motif sort of gets influenced by the musical context, and then sort of keeps transforming, but very classical way though. And so I took this material to see how far I could go with all these transformations. So that's how I realized I tried to create in the piece, and then at the end, actually, the performers actually they speak, these accents in the piece. So that's the concept of the piece. And when I was practicing, I really worked on the American accents. Although I keep failing it now, but like so I think maybe you guys have never done this. So you have some an audio book. So you keep playing the audio, and then it's like an ear training. So you make the graph over the just right on the letters, like like wiggles, like curves. So which intonation, which pitch was like, which word has a higher pitches and lower pitches, and where the accents comes, and then in terms of how in the pronunciation you divide the phrase, So and then you keep playing the audio and then reading it at the same time, with the same accent, same intonation, same the way of dividing the phrases. So so I practiced those sentences, or caption, like on TV, right? You turn on the caption, and then I actually practiced Oprah Winfrey's show. I watched it, and then turn the caption on, and then just try to speak like her, so when she was interviewing someone, exactly mimicking her way of speaking English. So so those memories became the motivation to write that piece. When I watched the YouTube video, it reminded of that English practice.
That reminds me of how, let's say, a jazz piano student might transcribe a pianist, and then you play along with the recording so that you can learn the swing feel. But I also appreciate you sharing how, despite having learned the American accent, you kind of forget it sometimes, and your Korean accent comes out. I just want to share this this idea I read in a poem a long time ago, which I cannot even remember. I can't remember what the title was, but the author says something like, "I have two tongues inside my mouth." One's so her native language was an Indian language called Gujarati, and so she's like, "I have this Gujarati tongue and an English tongue, and no matter how many times I try to cut off the Gujarati tongue, it will just grow back and fight with the English tongue that she's had to like develop." So I think that's a very expressive way of putting it.
When I speak English, I have to be more conscious to use more muscles here, around the jaw area, because in Korean language we don't use a lot of different muscles in the mouth. But I have to be very conscious, of switching the position of the movement, Then when I forget, then just my Korean accents just dominate the entire English, and then because the thing is, I mean, I did speak English when I was in Korea, when I was living in Korea, and but like it's like short sentences. Right?
Right.
Did you have dinner? You know, this kind of English. You know, but the thing is, you know, even though you didn't use any American accents, you know, my English teacher always understood what I was talking about.
Right.
But here, after I came, I realized that if I don't use American accents, actually people don't understand.
Right.
So when you make your sentences longer and longer, so this is something that, oh, you know, actually those American teachers, they put extra effort. They were in the context of the Konglish, you know, context, so they were able to understand. But yeah, it is, yeah, I guess here, yeah, without American accents, I think I cannot survive. So yeah.
Do you think, well, I'm sure you would agree that in today's society, because that film was made a long time ago, but in today's society, people are more accepting of other accents. Like you don't have a native native English accent, neither do I, nor does How You, and there's so many other people who don't have it. But I feel like it's pretty normal to find someone who speaks like this. Do you think this will also transition into the world of composition? Same. Um, like, do you think so? A lot of classical composition education is about, let's say, learning the um, musical history of, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, so on and so forth. And so we're learning their accent in a way. But do you think as time goes on, people are going to, again, like prioritize individualism as opposed to respecting the authenticity of that culture? Do you think people are going to let their own accents? Do you think people are going to feel more comfortable projecting their own accent? Personally, I feel like at a place like Berkeley, it was super easy for me to do that. I didn't have to write. Yeah, like I didn't have to write classical music. I could be informed by it, and I spent some time learning that accent. But again, like my tongue grew and it slapped the other one away, and it just sort of presented itself. So I'm curious if you think this idea of uh, respecting your own individual accent and your own cultural background, whether you think this is going to transition into the world of composition, maybe in the future, or I guess it is doing that right now at Berkeley. But yeah.
Now you're gonna move to California, so you should find it out and tell me what it would be like. Um, First of all, it's hard to define what American music is. First of all, I don't know about European music. I mean, I cannot say this, right? Because I teach European music. But the trend, you know, how they think and what they want to pass on, you know, to the next generation, this kind of thing. Um, yeah, I mean, Berkeley is such a unique place, and I am really grateful for that. Also, I kind of think, how can I say? I think of, uh, yeah, maybe I'm like one of the Western music composers. So I think of Western music as a tool for me to express myself, right? Like all these like classical music instruments or the techniques that I have, composition techniques that I have, they are the sort of a method, you know, but they are not the goal of my music, you know. First of all, I think we are learning this music from the schools and the academic institution, you know, thinking of how the curriculum works. When you said like, you know, the local us, I think still our curriculum is not very prepared for teaching or accepting might be easier, but sort of taking it seriously as a part of our curriculum, like teaching intercultural music making, for instance, right? Because I am talking about this because I'm Korean, right? Or let's say I'm a non-Western music teacher who came here after I finished my undergrad, so fully grew up there, right?
Yeah.
So it's easier for me to bring a different perspective to the composition. Although I sometimes force the how you do something in my lesson. Sometimes how you wanted to do something that I said nope. But it was all for your future. How you look at you, you know.
Greater good.
but I think the direction should be like that. But I think, to be honest with you, our curriculum is not very ready for that kind of direction. But individually depends on who you study with.
Yeah.
Like for instance, as I mentioned before, in many cases, I am lucky enough to have very creative, very unique young composers, who have very like complex idea, culturally, compositionally. So they always thought about how can I realize this idea into or this emotion, like also culturally very complicated emotions, and how can I project them through my sound. So individually, I can approach it because it's a composition lesson. So first of all, we have a deep conversation first. What are you searching for, right? So, and then sort of we try to build a model. What could be possible, and model can be one thing or two different things. Like that chooses something out of it. So, but curriculum in terms of music education curriculum it's very fixed. So maybe one or two courses in some grad programs they can implement certain courses. Then a professor who can teach that course can bring certain perspective of the music, but just remember we are in the West. Yeah, we are not the majority.
Right.
So yeah, I think maybe hopefully it can gradually, that kind of thought, that kind of a hope can make some power. As you grow up, how you grow when you guys become music teachers, professors, and then you guys teach the next generation, then it'll be closer to the globalization and more individual voices. Individual approach is something when we call individual approach, that's a very difficult one, actually. You have to understand this being. But even though I'm saying that, okay, even if I'm saying, oh, I understand you, but this is just one side of you, right?
Yeah.
I cannot fully understand you. Just what you talk about me, I'm trying to understand you, right? But still, that's the beginning of the individual, approach, right? So I think it's more about the efforts and how efforts can turn into the result of the in this case composition, right? But yeah, it's a very complicated questions, but because at Berklee many students don't have any emotional association with classical music.
Yeah.
So in that case, how can you define what contemporary music is? But then some students also don't have any emotional association with like particular jazz or or even pop. So that's a really like individual cases. That how can you define which music is contemporary music for you, as you have emotional engagement with, right? So sometimes I feel a little bit like, so also I need to find how I can feel connected with certain music, you know. So, but I think, but the most important part is like in 20s,
Yeah.
still like you need to be exposed to a lot of different kinds of music. I think it's more, it's not about what I like right now. It's more about, you know, like just you know, whatever, you know, music, you know, you can be exposed to, just be exposed to.
Yeah.
And then later, you know, your musical world starts to select just naturally.
Right.
Yeah. So sometimes, you know, who knows, you know, you would like, you know, classical music, Western music in your 40s,
Yeah. Maybe.
right? So you never know. Sometimes, you know, like even though you didn't like it, and sometimes, oh, makes sense, you know, but then all of a sudden, it just you get some engagement with it. So yeah.
That's very helpful, and I think maybe 10 years down the line, when how you and I
Of course.
watch this interview again, I think we'll have to send you a message and say you were right about all of this.
Oh, something that I want to tell. So when I was in grad school, not because of the any influence, one day just I had a realization. It came to my mind. Oh, we are all learning music from 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
Especially when you go to grad school, like, so now you are fully, you know, you will fully engage with contemporary new music, you know. But then I realized that, oh, this is not the new music.
Yeah.
It already done, right?
Yeah.
And then what we are doing was we are trying to reproduce, you know, reproducing this music. Well, I mean, in my own way, as much as possible. But then I started to think about, I mean, this is also an open question, but what is new music, you know? And then in our generation, what can be new music, you know? Still, I'm questioning about that. But at least, you know, in my music, maybe just a very, in the next piece, maybe or one or two things in my own way that I never tried in my old music. Then, you know, I want to create something new, you know, trying things
Yeah.
out. And then I think, speaking of individual approaches, like if we all try, you know, to create something new individually in our own way, I think as a result, collectively, we can create new music in our generation, my generation or your generation. I think that's very important.
Mm. Speaking of new music, I know. Well, this is a very bad segue, but I want to speak about your very recent project where you've tried to document the history of Korean comfort women
Mm-hmm.
in your music. Can you tell us a little bit about that project of yours?
Mm-hmm. So I've written three pieces based on um, Korean comfort woman. The first piece is called "The Angel's Broken," and the second piece is called "Nine," and then the third piece is called "The Unending Winter," and the three pieces all they are incorporating the field recordings of Korean comfort women's singing and interviews, so they are real voices. And this project began with the commission from Music United Us, the organization from Brandeis University, particularly from. I had a great opportunity to work with the Lydian String Quartet and Kamin, who is a Korean traditional instrument PD player. So this commission came with a very specific request to incorporate the field recording, which, yeah, as I explained it before, which has Korean comfort women's voices. So in Angels Broken, I chose one voice, Park Ok-sun, and she sang Virgin Diary, the old Korean pop song. So that was the beginning. But initially, like 12 years ago, I mean, from that time, in 2007, I had a commission to write about them. So in 2007, actually, for the first time, I went back to Korea. So at that time I thought, oh, I'm gonna write about them. So I need to meet them. So I visited their place. It's called the Nanumejip, the sharing house, which is located near Seoul. And I spent a day with them. And after I spent a day with them, I realized that, oh, I cannot write about them. So first of all, so when I saw them on the mass media, they were always the victims, always they were crying, and they always, they were in such a, they were suffered so much. And they did suffer. But what I'm trying to say is, when I first met them in person, my impression was, yes, they are the victims, but they are the survivors. They're very tough women, and in a way a little bit aggressive. Some women were very aggressive. So actually I didn't know how I could approach them. So, and then, but as I spent some time there, I had an opportunity to talk to them. And then, like I mentioned, oh, I was so naive. So I was like, oh, like you're, and when I think of your pain, and then one of the women said, what pain? What are you talking about? So then I realized that, oh, for them, actually, there have been so many people have visited for for those visitors certain purposes, right? Like political reason or social reason, whatever. So I thought, oh, whoa, I'm doing something wrong here, right? So yeah, there was it was a moment that I started to think, oh, maybe I'm doing something wrong here, And then there was a museum, so I went to the museum, and like there was a room, they built a model, taking after, based on what they said, So the room, they were captured, and then they had to live as sex slaves, So all these, experiences made me actually decide, oh, I'm not gonna do this project, because I realized that there's no way that I can express their trauma, someone else's trauma, which that is not mine, So I decided not to pursue that commission. But then 12 years later, again, I was asked to write about them. So yeah, so there was a moment that already, like, I think I learned like many different compositional sort of influences and techniques. So I had grown up as a composer, and also I thought that, oh, I'm there's no, still my thought was the same. So there's no way that I can express their trauma, but since they are disappearing, they are passing away, So I rather, I really want to create a documentation, of their existence, and making their existence as an art in my piece. So that's how I started to compose, Korean comfort woman. I would say, Korean comfort woman's, how can I say, like, voices, and then I was very lucky that there's a Korean TV producer. His name is Ho Moon-ho, and he has created a documentary about Korean comfort women. So he created an archive, which has all the videos and then interviews and Korean comfort women singing, and he actually allowed me to be able to use his archive. But there was one condition that, you know, he asked me to keep composing, keep creating work in the States, letting the people know about the existence of Korean comfort women. So it's a lifelong project for me. So I try to compose at least one work as much as possible, each year, or at least try, So somehow I can create like just own legacy, that it's my own way of archiving them through my music. So that's the project.
I never knew about that part of history, and so through your music, it's such a it's like such a meaningful way to document someone else's history. So thank you for that. It taught me about a different part of history. You said you used field recordings. What was your process like with the electronics part? Because I mean, I'm curious about that.
You mean particularly in this project or in general?
Maybe in this project.
In this project. Yeah. So one thing, like working on this Korean Comfort Woman project, actually, it's, so I talked about in intercultural music, there's always like sort of power relationship between like the cultural instrumental cultural material and then the Western material. Here, actually, the most usually when I compose or when you guys compose, sometimes, the composition itself in the middle of the piece starts speaking, So like in terms of composition techniques or aesthetics, or how the piece is going to be managed, develops, or like it has its own life, I feel like. And just, then I just, sort of make myself, just deeply go into. So, I mean, so the it's for the sake of composition I compose, right? Yeah. But in this case, the priority goes to this recording, field recording. So in the first piece, the Angels Broken, I was so careful that, I don't want to ruin anything, really sort of with full respect. I just thought about how I can sort of like preserve and with full respect, and making sure like this voice is the most important part of my composition. So even though composition a little bit more, it's hard to explain, like more naturally, like, composition itself, it's growing. Sometimes I have to whoa, like always, think about the balance between the field recording and then, the composing process, so that, so my composition was serving the field recording, in other words. And but then after the first piece, I learned how to do it a little bit. So, and it's more like making a documentary in your fictional work, right? So I think art, music, in a way, it always has some fictional material, right? So sometimes it is our idealized world, but once you have this field recording, you are placing yourself between sort of non-fiction, fiction, the boundaries. So you have to know where you are, So, and then in the second piece, actually, I was bold. So the second piece is called The Nine, after the 9 survivors. So I incorporate more voices, actually. So from the beginning, fully, incorporating their voices, up front, and then I kind of knew how to navigate, by compositional languages, between their voices with electronics. But the important point is that very important part of this composition is you have to create your own aesthetics behind it. So because the materials are so foreign to each other,
Yeah.
so sort of you have to think about how you want to or how you can integrate all these disparate elements into one piece and then making it into one artistic world, so um and then you have to think about actually human and society, the relationship behind it. But then in terms of audio, after all, it's a music,
Yeah.
so you have to navigate all different angles while you're composing. But then when you finish it, it's just one piece, so. And then in the third piece, the recent piece, Unending Winter, actually I had an imagination that like all these voices sort of transforming into like something unrecognizable, because they sort of, in our society, they lost their voices. um, as I keep thinking about this project, Korean corporate women itself, it's a very, they have lived in the dystopian world, because I don't know, in interview I can say this, but in a way they want the apology from the Japanese government, but they are passing away.
Yeah.
So now, what, like, I don't think there's no way they can hear the apology from the government, the Japanese government. So it's kind of like close the ending, so yeah, I was depressed about it a little bit, and like then the musical imagination was this field recording their real voices, through the sound processing, that they lost their sort of voices, and then just sort of spectrally actually manipulated, but sort of unrecognizable. But then but still there is it's called a Wednesday protest. So they have been doing that for a long time. So every Wednesday, there's a protest. So I mean, still, there we have this, the will, to keep fighting for justice. So like their voice unrecognizably manipulated or processed, but then after all, their voices just come back. So that was the first imagination in my piece, and then after that, with a book, and there's a storytelling, the story painting book. So incorporating that book, so there's some narration, going along with the piece. So yeah, so this project, in terms of with my artistic world, it keeps evolving, I think. But also, in a way, it really opens up my thoughts about how to connect me, and sort of I think about Korean corporate women, but when I watch the news, read about news, how war and women, they are they have to live in this injustice, then I think it's not sort of a fossilized history, it's still happening. So I think I'll keep working on this project.
Given how delicate the situation is, I think your contribution to documenting this is all the more powerful. So, again, thank you so much for documenting it and presenting this story to the world. I think it's important. So, and it's inspiring, because as a composer, it also forces me and maybe how you to think of more, or maybe less individualistic ways of making music, and maybe we can do something for society. And I feel like your cause is so convincing. So thank you so much for sharing that. We've reached the what I call the formal part, the end of the formal part. We're not done yet. So we have a quick rapid fire uh, questions round thing,
Okay.
which is very easy. You can speak about it for maybe like a second or
Okay.
just one word or something. So first question, and I think I can just hold the mic for you. Um, who's a composer you're listening to right now?
I might say myself
Okay.
because I'm revising my piece, so I had to keep listening to the recording to revise my piece. So yeah, that's why.
That's totally fair. um, a musical culture you're curious about. I think you answered this, but
Yeah, Irish music. Yeah,
cool. A musical instrument you want to write for.
organ.
Well, can I ask why organ?
Actually, I learned the organ for 2 months.
Mm.
But I think really, I it moves me somehow. Yeah. So
Just a deep connection.
yeah, it's hard to explain.
Favorite class you like to teach at Berklee?
Berklee, contemporary music class. Yeah.
I have taken that course and it's very good. And
Thank you.
Hao has taken that course too, and he's also saying it's very good. So you should
Thank
take that course with Yoon-Ji. Most important lesson you learned as a student.
How to be Yoon-Ji Lee in my music is the most important thing. Taught by Robert Kogan while I was studying with him at NEC.
That's awesome. Now this is the most difficult question, and I will have to hand you the mic for this one.
What is it?
What's your favorite cuisine?
Oh, oh. That's very. It's like asking me like, "What's your identity?" I mean, of course, Korean music a lot, but
food?
yeah, Korean foods. Especially, I don't have a lot of time to eat Korean foods these days. So yeah, because but I like American foods a lot too. It's very hamburger. And then this morning I woke up and then I want omelet. So actually I have very low tolerance about spicy food. So within Korean foods, actually I cannot eat a lot of spicy foods. Have you ever heard about a lame Korean?
No.
I'm the lame Korean who can't drink
Oh,
well and who can't eat spicy foods and who doesn't enjoy karaoke so much. So
okay.
yeah.
Well, that's good to know because how you and I will cook you some dinner now. So
Yeah.
we'll be careful.
Yeah, I like salads, like yeah.
Mhm.
And I don't know. I like just all kinds of food. Yeah, as long as it's not spicy, I eat anything. I eat to survive sometimes. So, the immigrant's mind. So yeah.
Well, we've reached the end of our interview.
Yay!
Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate the interview. I think it
I
might
really
be my
appreciate your time.
favorite interview yet. So I really enjoyed that.
Okay.
Would you like to tell the audience where they can find you on the internet?
My website www.yunjili.org, and then you can find other related links from my website, and I have a CD, so it's called the Padong. So also you can find my music from Bandcamp or YouTube videos. Yes.
Awesome. Cool. I think this went very well.